want to start by thanking Kristen Ingalls, Marty Jenkins, Janet Mocker, and Priscilla Marcus, and John Douglas for making this service possible and for the song that awaits us at the end of my sermon. I recently watched a documentary about the rise of the KKK in North Carolina during the 60s. It's called Klansville, USA. Not only did they have a well-greased organization that played upon the fears of the whites who struggled economically, they also had a grand clud, or clude, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but he was their chaplain. And as a chaplain, a minister, that horrified me. He would rile people up after the end of a fun-filled family apple pie kind of eating day. Gatherings all around the state were run like tent-pitching revivals. In the dark of night, Dorset, and that was his name, the chaplain of the KKK in North Carolina, shouted like an enraged preacher, inciting hatred and playing upon people's fears. They sang impassioned hymns accompanied by a piano. At the end of the service, they would erect and then light an immense cross. The culmination of this day-long, fun-filled day and fiery words striking fear in their hearts embarked a sense of holy work. It was ordained by God and in defense of their vulnerable families. A former KKK member recalled on this film how deeply meaningful it was to be initiated into the Klan during a secret ceremony. He'd grown up in abject poverty, and nothing he did could ever help lift him up with a standing in the community. He felt great suffering, but the KKK gave him a place. With civil rights activists actively on the move, it seemed that no one cared about the plight of the impoverished whites, except the Klan. The North Carolina Klan prided itself in its commitment to nonviolence, though it did have its own little wing of militia-ready thugs, who, with the guidance of their leader Bob Jones, would terrorize blacks and those who were their allies. But with pride and deep reverence, this fellow described his initiation and the words of welcome that were etched in his memory. I now bestow upon you the title of Klansman. You will never be alone anymore. Kneeling before a cross of fire, he was in tears, awash with happiness, feeling that the Klan was better than anything he had ever experienced before. Later, he realized the errors of his way, but at first it was better than anything he had experienced. Normally, when I hear about the KKK, I shiver with goosebumps, and I can hardly imagine what it would feel like to be a Klansman or Klanswoman. I hear the label KKK, and a wall instantly goes up. I have no tolerance, no feeling except disgust and remorse. But hearing this fellow talk about his story, I felt sorrow and was surprised. I could hear his pain and his suffering, his brokenness, and his isolation that led him to join such a hateful group. The Klan offered community and identity, a sense of inner pride, protection, and what seemed to be the Andy Griffith symbols justice sort of way of life that was obviously sponsored by God. He reminded me of a sorrowful prisoner, female prisoner I once knew, who laughed with irony saying that prison had been the only institution who had its arms wide open to her. In many ways, the KKK launched a holy war against African Americans and anyone who supported civil rights. Seeking ways to dismantle it, the FBI discovered financial misconduct of the founder, Bob Jones, and managed to splinter the North Carolina group just 10 years after its inception. But the Klan left ruin in its short wake, and it continued to thrive in other states. Quite eerily, good Christians were Klansmen and women, just as there were good principled Christians who enslaved Africans. These examples of religion used as a tool to justify violence is enough to lead one to believe that religion is the problem. Reflecting on religion and rationality, Jon Stewart once remarked, and he's a comedian, yes, reason has been a part of organized religion ever since two nudists took dietary advice from a talking snake. Well, all too often when I reveal that, yes, I am a minister, I try to offer, maybe I'm an adjunct professor one day and chaplain the other, but when I say I'm a minister, I get a lot of different reactions, and one is confession. People start confessing to me why they have not gone to church and tell me all these reasons why they haven't come to church. It's okay, it's okay. Another increasingly common response is that they're not religious, but spiritual, and some uncomfortably move away from me thinking that I might try to convince them to be a part of my own religion. And then many spring into passion challenge that religion is the cause of all wars, and that is why they are not religious in the least. In many ways, they are correct. We need only remember about the bloody Crusades, the devastating wake of the Inquisition, and the hundreds of wars where both sides felt God was on their side. God known by many names. Today we hear daily reports about heinous extremists doing all sorts of violence against very innocent people. Literally millions of people have been enslaved or lost their lives at the hands of those who felt they were upstanding citizens defending both God and country, whatever century or empire. I found a cartoon recently of what looked like a Roman soldier holding a bloody knife, and in his other arm, was a bearded man. And the Roman-looking soldier guy was named War, and the bearded guy was named Religion. And with a tear in his eye, War says, "Where would I be without you?" The Crusades were inspired by religious passion, but they were also deeply political. Karen Armstrong did an amazing job at looking through all of our history, religious and secular, looking at religion with that question. Is religion the problem? I invite you and urge you to read that book. It's fantastic. She noted that Pope Urban II let knights of Christendom loose on the Muslim world during the Crusades to extend the power of the church eastward and create a papal monarchy that would control Christian Europe. The deadly Inquisition was an attempt to gain control over the divisive civil war in Spain. And then, without religion, secular nationalism in the modern world has led to the Armenian genocide and Hitler's death camps, all in quests for power. On a very real level, it appears that religion has been a powerful player in much of the evil in the world. In religious and in secular states, the other, the enemy, becomes dehumanized, made into monsters, dividing the righteous and those who would be oppressed, or killed with valor and pride. It is demonstrated again and again how religion can be used as a tool of oppression and violence. So my sermon could end now. I could just say yes and but no, we all know there's more to this story. Armstrong rightly asserts to claim that religion has a single, unchanging, and inherently violent essence is not accurate. She illustrates her point by reminding us that identical religious beliefs and practices have inspired diametrically opposed courses of action. And if you want to know them, read her book. She skims from the burgeoning field of neuroscience as well, to show that the human brain has developed and can affect our actions quite powerfully as well. If triggered, we can act out of a self-preserving reptilian brain that focuses on survival. Or we can act out of the newer part of our brain, the neocortex, that holds powers of reasoning and self-awareness, empathy, and the ability to comprehend that life is filled with complexities. Armstrong also urges powerfully that as our brains evolved, so have we evolved from being hunters and gatherers to agrarian-based living. She builds a convincing argument that points to the change from small egalitarian, more or less egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups to agrarian ones that led to surplus and the accumulation of wealth and eventually to hierarchy. Hierarchy became justified. They needed order. They needed leaders. They needed religious leaders and military, and they needed people to do the work. When surplus is built upon others' backs and power is held in the hands of a few, inequity and brutalization are created simultaneously. Raids and wars waged with ambition to possess more wealth and power began. And there were benefits to civilization. We know them. People were permitted, those up on the top were permitted more time to speculate about philosophy, astronomy, arts, music, and so much more. So these are two very huge brushstrokes about reviewing our human brain development and our human development as into civilizations. There's much good and bad in both. And there's wisdom in the Chinese proverb, which says 90% of what we see is behind our eyes. I love this. 90% of what we see is behind our eyes. I would venture that before the modern era, 90% of what we saw behind our collective eyes was rooted in something that was very sacred. It was the lens through which people saw life. The sacred wasn't separated like it may be now. The hunt was sacred. Is shopping sacred today? Forest clearing, farming, state building, and even games were sacred. Commerce, philosophy, astronomy, and all aspects of looking into the science of life, those were sacred. People endowed everything with significance. As such, states and empires gained power through the use of force, and religion became deeply implicated in that violence. John Locke believed that the separation of church and state would create peace. But we also see that with the world's first experiment of such a government, that our nation has not been adverse to war. Our secular political aggression in the world is often felt as oppressive, lethal, invasive in the developing world. We have only to think about the genocide of the Native Americans and our rationale for slavery. Our division between church and state did not protect people in our quest toward establishing a wealthy country. and understanding the rise of extremism, like Muslim extremism, is of particular importance to us today. We must see that we are part of that problem. Armstrong reminds us when Muslims attack churches and synagogues today, they are not driven to that by Islam. The Quran commands Muslims to respect the faith of the people of the book. Few of us know this in the West. And the people of the book are the Hebrews, the Jewish and Christian people. She continues, this new aggression towards religious minorities in the nation-state is largely the result of political tensions arising from Western imperialism, which also is associated with Protestant Christianity, and the Palestinian problem. Each particular extremist group has its own particular histories, but I can venture safely by saying they all likely come from a place of marginalization and a quest for power and standing, just like the man in the KKK. He was drawn to the simplicity of those who were right and those who were wrong, to those who were righteous in the sight of God, and those who were evil or monstrous. And he was no longer alone, and life was meaningful, and he was cared for. Today, in our very connected world, we face a multitude of very dangerous possibilities. We need not look to see the peril. It's right here, in our collective brokenness and alienation from one another that so often characterizes our world. We must try to understand one another. I offer this tale. One day the Pope decided that all Jews had to leave Rome. Naturally, there was a big uproar from the Jewish community, so the Pope made a deal. He would have a religious debate. He would argue on his side, and one member from the Jewish community would argue on theirs. If they won, the Jews could stay, and if the Pope won, they had to go. The Jews realized they had no choice, and they looked for a champion who would defend them and their faith. But it was so risky that no one dared. And so they chose an old man named Moshe to represent them. Being old and poor, he had less to lose, they said. He asked for one condition, that they not use words in this debate. The Pope agreed. The day of the debate came, and Moshe and the Pope sat opposite of one another for a full minute before the Pope raised his hands and showed 3 fingers. And Moshe looked back at him and raised 1 finger. The Pope waved his fingers in a circle around his head, and Moshe pointed to the ground where he sat. The Pope pulled out a wafer and a glass of wine, and Moshe pulled out an apple. The Pope stood up and said, "I give up! This man is too good. The Jews can stay." An hour later, the cardinals were all around the Pope asking him what had happened. What happened? The Pope said, "Well, first I held up 3 fingers to represent the Trinity." And Moshe, he ended up holding up 1 finger to remind me that there is still one God common to both religions. Then I waved my fingers up in the air to show him that God was all around us. And he pointed to the ground, showing that God was also right with us. And then I pulled out the wine and the wafer to show that God absolves us from our sins. And then Moshe pulled out an apple to remind us of original sin. He had an answer for everything. What could I do? Meanwhile, the Jewish community, the crowd came around Moshe, amazed at what he had done. This feeble-minded old man had done what scholars were too afraid to try. "What happened, Moshe? You were amazing." "Well," Moshe said, "first, he said to me that the Jews had 3 days to move out. And I told him not one of us is leaving. And staying right here. And then, I don't know what happened. He took out his lunch and I took out mine. Well, an even better illustration of understanding one another through storytelling is found in something from Steve Jacobson. And some of you might know him. He's a local Presbyterian minister. And he now leads La Casa de Maria. He once told a story to me from his days as a pastor. He invited a young Muslim man to come speak to his congregation after 9/11. And later he called upon a particularly conservative member of his church to see what she thought. She responded by saying, "I don't agree with his politics, and I don't understand his religion, but we could be neighbors." There is power in hearing another one's story. It offers a chance to share our humanity, our triumphs, our losses, our heart's deepest longings, and our highest aspirations. Getting to know another preschooler, my sage daughter, at the wise age of 4, said, and it had been a hard day. At the end of school, I picked her up and she said, "Adriana and I speak different languages, but we cry the same." That is the point of connection. Empathy, feeling compassion and love in each other's pain and in each other's joy. Though religions have become inextricably a part of the violence in our global history, we also know that there's another side to religion. Countless prophets and sages, shamans, imams, rabbis, and ministers have also helped people to face the complexities inherent in life, urging us to love instead of hate, to move away from our small-minded lizard brains, ego-led desires, to focus on the broader concerns for others, and also to feel that connection to the grandeur of life, to feel that sounding of something larger than we are rushing through us, all of us. Is religion the problem? Again, I turn to the sage comedian Jon Stewart. Religion. It has given people hope in the world torn apart by religion. Yes and no. Yes. It has helped spur and legitimize violence, incredibly devastating violence. Ever since the rise of nation states and the earliest forms of civilization. And it has at the same time, without ceasing, spoken up in the midst of conflict to offer a vision of a more loving, peaceful, and just way of life. We often hear about the gentle Saint Francis of Assisi and how he was loved by all animals. But we don't hear often about the audacity he had during the disastrous 5th Crusade. He went against the cardinal's orders. He went behind enemy lines and spoke directly to the Egyptian Sultan, Camille. He and his companion brother Illuminato very easily could have been decapitated on sight. Christian heads, I guess, brought in a high price. But when they were captured, people thought they were messengers from the Christian camp, and so they brought him to the Sultan. And there he spoke with the Sultan, both expressing with sincerity for one another. And we don't know exactly what was said, but we do know from then on St. Francis of Assisi spoke out against war and for peace. And that the Sultan was known by the Coptic Egyptians as being very kind and tolerant. They shared their stories and goodwill. It was not enemy to enemy, but human to human, with each drawing courage and guidance from his own religion. Today, this very moment, There are millions of people of every faith working to help another person, to heal the sick, to find remedies for our global warming, reaching out to those in need. It comes from within us all. That need to connect, to love, to care for one another. Let us affirm that deeply embedded impulse to love and move boldly with tenacity like squirrels into the future. Amen.